The dojo master leaned in, smirking. "You think you can walk in here and challenge me?" The students laughed, their fists tightening, ready to tear this stranger apart. But Reacher didn't flinch. He just asked one simple question. And when they heard it, the laughter died. The students stepped back, and the master's face turned pale, because in that moment they all knew they had just picked the wrong man to challenge. Welcome to Jack Reacher Heroics. Let's uncover what really happened. Jack Reacher walked into the small, unassuming town under a gray sky, the wind cutting through the streets with an edge that suggested a storm was coming. His boots echoed off the cracked sidewalks, the only sound breaking the usual quiet. He wasn't looking for trouble, but then again, trouble seemed to find him more often than not. The dojo stood at the end of the street, tucked between a rundown diner and a hardware store. The windows were fogged, and the sign above the door swayed gently in the breeze. Its letters faded from years of neglect. It didn't look like much, but there was a reputation here. The kind of reputation that spoke of discipline, respect, and an arrogant sense of superiority that only the truly skilled could claim. Reacher had been hearing about the dojo for days, but he wasn't here to prove anything. He wasn't interested in its master or his disciples. But as he walked past the doors, a group of young men stood in the window, laughing at something. One of them caught sight of Reacher, his eyes narrowing before he smirked. Inside, the walls were lined with trophies and martial arts paraphernalia, awards that clearly meant something to the owner, but nothing to Reacher. He stepped inside, the doors swinging with a soft creak, and immediately felt the temperature drop. The dojo smelled of sweat and old wood, a place where hard work was done, but where arrogance also thrived. The dojo master, a man in his mid-40s, sat behind a desk at the far end of the room, his arms crossed, and his expression one of supreme self-confidence. He looked Reacher up and down, sizing him up as if he were an insect beneath his shoe. "Can I help you?" the master asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Reacher just nodded, his gaze steady. No words, no threats, just silence. But in that silence, something stirred. Something was about to change. The dojo had built its reputation long before Jack Reacher ever set foot in this town. It wasn't known for producing humble students or fostering quiet discipline. No, this place thrived on spectacle. The master, Hiroshi Kato, had cultivated a myth around himself, one of unchallenged skill, unbeatable strength, and the ability to defeat anyone who dared to question his authority. His students walked around town like they were royalty, heads high, as if the dojo's success validated everything they did. There were whispers about Kato's methods. Some said he was ruthless, pushing his students beyond their limits, stripping away their humanity in the name of mastery. Others claimed he'd build a following by teaching not just combat, but control over people, using fear as his greatest weapon. Those who failed to meet his standards often disappeared, leaving nothing but rumors behind. The dojo's name carried weight, so much so that people stopped questioning it. Most in the town knew better than to challenge Kato's authority, and those who did were either ignored or quietly forced to leave. Outsiders, like Reacher, were a rarity, but they were treated as curiosities, either potential students to be molded or troublemakers to be dismissed. Reacher had heard the stories about Kato before, but he didn't take much stock in rumors. The more someone talked about their greatness, the less Reacher believed in it. He wasn't looking for a fight, but something about the dojo, its overblown reputation, its cocky atmosphere, didn't sit right with him. As he walked further into the dojo, he saw the disciples practicing. They moved with mechanical precision, their movements flawless but lifeless. There was no soul in their technique, no passion, just repetition. The dojo's reputation, it seemed, was built on fear and perfection, not real skill or understanding. And Reacher could already tell something had to change. Reacher's entrance into the dojo was nothing more than a quiet movement, a shift in the air that barely registered with anyone. He wasn't here for a fight, nor did he intend to stir up trouble. He simply walked in like anyone else might walk into a room, unnoticed, unassuming, as if he were just another face in the crowd. The dojo was silent except for the low hum of feet scraping against the floor and the occasional thud of fists hitting padded bags. Reacher's presence didn't cause a stir. The students, clad in their traditional GI, continued their practice, eyes locked on their instructor, their movements perfectly synchronized. To them, Reacher was just another outsider, and outsiders didn't merit attention. Not until they did. He stood at the edge of the training area, observing without a word, his hands tucked loosely in his pockets. His expression was neutral, his posture relaxed. There was no hint of aggression in his demeanor, no arrogance to provoke the room. He seemed like someone who didn't care whether or not anyone noticed him. And for the moment, no one did. Kato, sitting at the far end of the room, watched Reacher's entrance without so much as a blink. The dojo master was accustomed to dealing with people who wanted something from him, usually respect or a quick lesson. He was used to being the center of attention, the one who set the tone. But with Reacher, there was something different. Kato leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping slowly on the armrest, studying the man who had entered his domain. No overt challenge had been made, no aggressive stance taken. But something about the quiet man's presence felt off. He wasn't loud, wasn't trying to prove anything. It was the kind of quiet that made Kato uneasy. Reacher's unassuming entrance was a subtle disruption to the harmony the dojo had built. He wasn't a threat yet, but in his stillness, he was already unsettling the balance Kato had so carefully maintained. Hiroshi Kato had seen his fair share of challenges. But this man, this stranger who walked in without ceremony or fanfare, was something different. Kato watched him from his desk, his eyes narrowing as he sized Reacher up. The room was still, the hum of the students' training now a background noise that barely registered. Kato's mind shifted gears. He stood slowly, the scraping of his chair against the floor breaking the silence. The students paused mid-movement, sensing the shift in their instructor's demeanor. Kato stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Reacher, as if daring him to make the first move. "I don't know who you are," Kato said, his voice calm but laced with a challenge. "But in my dojo, we earn respect." He stood tall in front of Reacher, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. Reacher, still unassuming, didn't flinch. His eyes were steady, his posture relaxed, like a man who had been in 100 similar situations and knew that this wasn't about words. Kato continued, his voice lowering just slightly. "Do you think you can walk in here, disrespect the tradition of my dojo, and leave without proving yourself? You don't just earn respect. You fight for it. Show me your worth, or leave." Kato's challenge was clear. This was no test of skill, no demonstration of martial prowess. It was about dominance. It was about stripping away the facade of confidence in the room and establishing who was in charge. Reacher didn't answer at first. He didn't need to. Instead, he glanced around the room, taking in the eyes of Kato's disciples, all of them waiting for their master's signal. The young men, so full of themselves, thought the dojo's reputation could shield them from reality. Reacher's gaze returned to Kato. Without a word, he stepped forward, his movements deliberate, measured. He wasn't seeking trouble, but trouble had found him. And this time, it would be Kato who would have to prove his worth. The moment Reacher took a step forward, a ripple of amusement spread through the dojo. Kato's disciples exchanged knowing looks, their smirks evident. They had seen this before, outsiders, brimming with misplaced confidence, entering the dojo and thinking they could challenge the master. They'd learned the hard way that Kato's style, his philosophy, was invincible. Kato stood tall, his arms crossed over his chest, watching Reacher with a quiet smile, the kind of smile that only someone who had built his life around absolute control could wear. "You still don't understand, do you?" he said, his voice laced with amusement. "You think this is a movie, don't you? A simple man in a room full of experts. You got the look, I'll give you that. But this isn't a fight for pride. This is a fight for your life." The disciples chuckled softly, their eyes lighting up as if they were watching a play unfold. They'd all been in the ring with Kato, felt the precision and power of his style. None of them had ever made it out without a lesson. And now, this man, whoever he was about to get the same lesson. Reacher didn't react to the laughter. He didn't need to. He simply adjusted his stance, eyes locked on Kato, unflinching. The dojo was filled with the sound of shifting feet and the soft hum of breathing, but the laughter that followed was louder, almost mocking. You know, Kato continued, still smiling, we don't need your kind in here. This is a place of discipline, not your kind of theatrics. You may have learned a thing or two on the streets, but this is where real mastery happens. So, if you're ready to throw your pride away, I'll show you what happens when you try to measure up to a master. The room fell into a tense silence as the laughter died down. Every student, every eye was now on Reacher. They weren't just watching a fight. They were watching an event. The tension grew thick, almost unbearable, but Reacher remained still calm. The master's words had fallen on deaf ears. The fight, when it came, would speak for itself. The laughter lingered in the air, but it didn't reach Reacher. He was focused, eyes never wavering from Kato's, his posture relaxed as though he had all the time in the world. The dojo's reputation had no power over him. He didn't care about the prestige, the pride, or the spectators who sat there waiting for him to fail. He only cared about what happened next. Kato stood there, his arms crossed, his smirk still firmly planted on his face. You must be wondering why we keep laughing, he said, voice laced with mockery. It's because of the arrogance of people like you. The ones who think they can waltz in here and challenge me without even understanding what you're stepping into. The disciples around the room exchanged glances, their laughter dying into quiet snickers. They watched as Reacher's stillness contrasted with their energy. His calmness made them uncomfortable. It made Kato uncomfortable too, but he refused to show it. Reacher's response was a simple shrug. He didn't need to explain himself. He wasn't here for validation, nor was he interested in bowing to their expectations. He was here because Kato had made a challenge that wasn't just about physical prowess, but about pride, about humility. I'm not here to entertain you, Reacher said quietly, his voice steady and even. And I'm not here to prove anything to you. But if you think I'm a threat, I'll show you exactly why I'm not. That stopped them cold. Kato's smile faltered for just a second before it returned, colder now. You think your words will make a difference? He sneered. This is my dojo. You're nothing but a newcomer with a bad attitude. And you'll learn very quickly how we handle disrespect. The room was thick with tension as Kato stepped forward, closing the space between them. His disciples watched, wide-eyed, waiting for the show to unfold. But Reacher remained calm, his eyes focused, his body still. The battle wasn't about the noise. It wasn't about the taunts. It was about the fight. And that was something no one here, not even Kato, had truly understood. Kato took a slow, deliberate step forward, his presence filling the room with an unmistakable tension. The dojo's disciples stood in a loose formation around the ring, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. No one moved, no one spoke, as though they knew something was about to happen that would determine more than just physical strength. This was about power, control, and dominance. And in Kato's dojo, he was the one who commanded it. Since you're so eager to prove yourself, Kato said, his voice cutting through the silence, let's start with something simple. A test. A small one. To show me you even have the skill to back up your attitude. Reacher didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the challenge, except to shift his weight slightly, just enough to show he was ready. He'd been in countless situations like this, tests, challenges, and confrontations where people believed they could measure him up with a quick display of power. But none of it mattered. What mattered was how he moved, how he responded, and how quickly he could end the test. Kato gestured to one of his disciples, a tall, muscular young man with a cocky grin plastered on his face. The disciple stepped forward, his body language radiating confidence. He bowed slightly to Kato and then to Reacher, his eyes sharp with the promise of an easy victory. Let's see how you handle this, the disciple sneered, circling Reacher with a predator's grace. The first strike came fast, a powerful kick aimed at Reacher's midsection. But Reacher was already moving, his body flowing with smooth precision as he sidestepped the attack effortlessly. The young fighter overextended, his balance shifting. Reacher didn't hesitate. A quick, controlled jab to the man's ribs sent him stumbling backward, the wind knocked out of him. The room fell silent. The disciple recovered quickly, glaring at Reacher, but the fight had already shifted. Cato's smugness faltered just slightly, his eyes narrowing as he processed what had just happened. The first test had been passed, and Cato could feel the change in the air. This wouldn't be as easy as he had thought. The young disciple staggered back, shaking off the sting of Reacher's jab. He glared at the man who had just made him look foolish in front of his peers, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Cato's disciples, once eager for a show, now watched with a subtle wariness that hadn't been there before. They'd seen their master easily dispatch challengers, but this stranger, this man who barely moved, was different. He hadn't fought back with aggression, nor had he played into the showy display they were accustomed to. The disciple wiped his mouth, visibly pissed off. This wasn't the easy win he had been promised. But there was a growing recognition in his eyes, one that hinted he understood something had changed. Cato, his expression still cold, nodded to the disciple to continue, but this time the young fighter didn't rush in. Instead, he began to circle, keeping his distance. His eyes darted between Reacher's relaxed form and Cato's steady gaze. The dojo's usual tactics weren't working. The usual confidence, the bravado, it didn't matter here. There was no rhythm to Reacher's movements, no pattern to track. He wasn't a fighter you could predict or outmaneuver. He wasn't playing by their rules. Reacher remained still, his eyes following the disciple's every move. It was the calm before the storm, but the storm wouldn't come in the way Cato expected. Reacher wasn't about to waste energy chasing a fight. He was waiting, and waiting was a tactic all its own. The disciple lunged forward again, this time with a feint. He moved to Reacher's left, a fast hook meant to catch him off guard, but Reacher was already anticipating the move. As the punch came, Reacher simply dropped low, his body sliding beneath it. In one swift motion, he swept the disciple's legs out from under him, sending him crashing onto the floor. Cato's eyes flashed with something more than mere surprise. This wasn't just strength. This was precision. Reacher wasn't fighting by the rules. He was rewriting them. And in that moment, Cato knew he was facing someone who understood fighting in a way none of his disciples ever could. The disciple lay on the floor, gasping for air as Reacher stood over him, his stance relaxed, his eyes steady. The room was eerily quiet, the usual murmur of whispered conversations and half-hearted cheers gone. Reacher didn't move. He simply watched the young fighter struggle to rise. There was no satisfaction in his gaze, no thrill in the victory. His face remained unreadable, as though nothing remarkable had happened. Cato, standing just a few feet away, watched with growing frustration. He had never seen one of his disciples lose so easily. The dojo's unshakable pride, built on years of dominance, was crumbling in real time, and it was hard for Cato to swallow. His reputation, his entire identity, had always been rooted in the belief that no one could match him or his students. "Get up," Cato muttered, his voice tight. The disciple struggled to his feet, clearly shaken, his confidence shattered. He avoided eye contact with Reacher, clearly embarrassed by the ease with which he had been taken down. Reacher didn't speak. He didn't need to. His calmness, his stillness, was a louder statement than any words could ever be. The disciple looked at him, then at Cato, who nodded for him to continue. This time, the young man approached more cautiously, not rushing, but studying Reacher's every move. But Reacher still didn't react. He didn't fidget, didn't shift his weight. He simply waited. It was a quiet challenge, a stark contrast to the brash, aggressive style the dojo had conditioned its students to expect. When the disciple launched himself again, slower this time, Reacher didn't engage in the usual exchange of strikes. Instead, with one swift movement, he sidestepped, then tapped the disciple's shoulder, just hard enough to throw him off balance. The young man staggered again, a look of confusion spreading across his face. Reacher's calm was impenetrable. Nothing could faze him. "Are you finished?" Reacher finally asked, his voice as even as ever. The question wasn't a taunt. It was a quiet observation, and it cut through the room, hanging in the air long after the words had been spoken. Kato's eyes narrowed as he watched Reacher's calm, methodical dismantling of his disciple. The room was silent except for the sound of heavy breathing. His student, now standing with shaky legs, refused to meet Reacher's gaze, his earlier bravado completely gone. But Cato? He remained unshaken. His posture straightened, and the smug grin he wore had barely faltered. The master's arrogance was his armor, and it was a thick, impenetrable shield. He didn't need to rush into a fight with Reacher. He had no doubt in his mind that his skill, honed over decades, could crush any challenger who entered his dojo. He had seen the look on Reacher's face, that quiet calm, that unreadable expression. It was the kind of silence that always preceded a fall. He wasn't worried. "You seem to think you've impressed me," Cato said, his voice dripping with confidence. He stood at the center of the room, arms crossed, his eyes still locked on Reacher. "But let me make something clear. What you've shown is nothing more than a fluke. A beginner's move that worked once. You won't get that chance again." Reacher didn't flinch. His face remained neutral, unreadable. Cato's smugness only deepened as he continued, his words carrying the weight of years of dominance. "In my dojo, we don't waste time with showy tricks or cheap wins. We train to be perfect. We fight to dominate, not to entertain. You can't match that with some street brawler nonsense." Cato took a slow step toward Reacher, his gaze intense. "But I will give you one more chance," he said, his voice low. "A real fight this time. No more easy moves. No more distractions. Just you and me." The dojo's air felt thick with expectation, but Cato didn't let a flicker of doubt show on his face. His students, still frozen in their places, awaited their master's victory. He was certain of his skill, sure of his superiority. Reacher's calmness only seemed to fuel Cato's belief that the outcome was inevitable. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The moment Cato issued the challenge, the atmosphere in the dojo shifted. The air seemed to grow thicker, charged with anticipation. The disciples straightened, some shifting their weight from foot to foot, eager to witness the inevitable showdown. The soft sounds of footsteps and the distant hum of the street outside faded into the background. All that mattered now was the confrontation between Cato and the silent stranger who had dared to challenge him. Reacher didn't move. He didn't acknowledge the challenge with words or gestures, just stood there, his eyes calm, his posture relaxed. It was as if he had all the time in the world. Cato, on the other hand, was a coiled spring, eager to demonstrate that his mastery would be more than enough to break the man's silence, to wipe away the smugness he'd seen in Reacher's eyes. The first movement came from Cato. He lunged forward with a precision that only years of training could produce, his fist slicing through the air in a fast, calculated punch. But Reacher had already anticipated it. He sidestepped effortlessly, barely shifting his weight, as though he had known exactly where Cato's strike would land. It was smooth, fluid, a simple, efficient movement that left Cato looking like he'd swung at nothing. Cato's eyes narrowed. This was not the challenge he had expected. He tried again, this time with a kick aimed at Reacher's midsection. But once more, Reacher was already moving. He stepped back, his body just far enough to avoid the kick by inches, and then, without hesitation, he reached out, grabbing Cato's arm as it passed by him. With a quick, controlled twist, Reacher took Cato's balance, sending the master stumbling forward. The dojo fell into an uneasy silence. Cato regained his stance quickly, his eyes flashing with a mix of surprise and anger. He wasn't used to being outmaneuvered like this. Not by anyone, let alone a stranger. Reacher didn't gloat, didn't show any signs of triumph. He just waited, his focus unbroken, ready for the next move. Cato knew now, this wasn't going to be easy. Cato's frustration was barely concealed as he reset his stance, his eyes narrowing with each of Reacher's calm, measured movements. The silence between them was palpable, broken only by the sound of Cato's quick breaths and the shuffle of feet against the dojo floor. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He had expected to dominate the stranger with speed, with experience, but Reacher's presence, his stillness, made it seem almost effortless. The master struck again, this time with a flurry of quick punches, rapid jabs meant to overwhelm Reacher. Kato's movements were fast, precise, each punch designed to catch his opponent off guard, to break the calm composure that Reacher maintained so effortlessly. But as the punches came, Reacher moved with the grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times. His body swayed just enough to let each strike pass by, not dodging, not avoiding, but simply letting them slip past him like water running over rocks. Kato's face tightened with anger. The younger fighter's smooth movements, his refusal to engage, were starting to unravel his confidence. He launched himself forward again, a low sweep aimed to take Reacher's legs out from under him, his form flawless, built to end the fight in a flash. It was a move that had taken down many opponents before, a move that would leave anyone else scrambling to recover. But Reacher, still watching with quiet intensity, didn't panic. As the kick came in, he dropped to a crouch, just low enough for the sweep to miss. His hand shot out, grabbing Kato's ankle with the speed of a striking snake. The momentum of Kato's attack worked against him as Reacher twisted sharply, pulling the leg out from under the master, and in one smooth motion, sent Kato crashing to the floor. The dojo was completely still. Kato lay there for a heartbeat longer than necessary, stunned by the sudden loss of control. He wasn't just defeated in that moment. He was exposed, vulnerable in a way that cut deeper than any physical blow. Reacher didn't move. He simply stood, his expression as calm as ever, as though he had expected nothing less. The room hung heavy with silence, the kind that feels thick enough to cut through. Kato remained on the ground for a moment longer than anyone expected, the shock of his fall still settling in. His body was still, but his mind was racing. He hadn't just lost his balance. He'd lost control, lost the very thing that defined him. A master, a teacher, the one who commanded respect. Now, here he was, on the floor, humiliated by a man who hadn't even broken a sweat. The disciples, once full of cocky confidence, shifted uncomfortably. They stood frozen, eyes darting between Kato and Reacher, unsure of how to respond. Some had their arms crossed, trying to mask their unease with false bravado. Others shifted their weight from foot to foot, clearly disturbed by what they had witnessed. No one had ever seen their master lose, not like this, and it wasn't just the fall. It was the way Reacher moved, the way he stayed in control with so little effort. Kato finally rose, pushing himself off the ground with a mix of frustration and forced composure. His breath was steady, but his eyes burned with the need to regain his dominance. He straightened his GI, though the gesture was more about regaining his own dignity than any real preparation for the next move. The tension in the dojo reached a boiling point. The room had always been a place of control, of certainty. But now, it felt like everything was shifting beneath their feet. The disciples were beginning to see something they hadn't expected. Not just a challenge to Kato's authority, but the possibility that their revered master was not invincible. Some of them glanced at each other, silently asking the question they all had on their minds. Is he really the strongest? Kato's gaze locked onto Reacher, and for the first time, there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Doubt. It was fleeting, but undeniable, and it sent a ripple of unease through the dojo. The master might have been the one leading the fight, but it was Reacher who had the room's attention now. The balance of power had already shifted, and no one knew how much further it would go. The silence between them stretched long, a quiet battlefield in itself. Reacher stood perfectly still, his posture relaxed, yet every muscle in his body remained coiled, ready for anything. His eyes, steady and calm, never left Kato's, but there was no challenge in them, no taunt, just quiet focus. The silence wasn't a statement. It was simply the way Reacher operated. He had nothing to prove. His calmness was a reminder, not just to Kato, but to everyone watching, that real strength didn't need to announce itself. Kato, still gathering his bearings, took a deep breath. His chest rose and fell slowly as he tried to suppress the frustration gnawing at him. His usual confidence, the one that had held sway over the dojo for years, was faltering. And there, in front of him, stood Reacher, a man who had done nothing more than stand his ground and wait. For a moment, Kato considered his options. He could charge again, try to dominate, to reassert himself. But something held him back. The arrogance he had carried for so long was starting to feel like a mask. A fragile one. Every time he took a step, every time he moved, Reacher seemed to be waiting for him, always one step ahead, without moving at all. It was disorienting. It was unnerving. The dojo's disciples shifted uneasily, glancing from their master to the stranger who had so easily outwitted him. Some looked worried, others seemed intrigued. But no one dared to speak, afraid of breaking the stillness that had settled over the room like a heavy fog. Kato's grip on his composure tightened. He couldn't afford to show weakness. Not here, not now. So, with a stiff movement, he straightened himself and took a step forward, eyes narrowing. But even then, Reacher didn't react. The fight wasn't about strength or skill. It was about the mental game. And Reacher's silence, his absolute refusal to engage with anything other than the fight itself, was a weapon more lethal than any punch or kick. It was in the space between words, between actions, that Kato's confidence continued to crack. Kato took another step forward, his breath steadying, but his mind was racing. The disbelief gnawed at him, a relentless undercurrent beneath the calm facade he desperately tried to maintain. How had this man, this stranger, managed to turn his dojo into a mockery? With every move, Reacher dismantled not just his disciples' pride, but the very foundation Kato had built his entire identity on. The room seemed to shrink as Kato closed the distance between them, his mind whirling with calculations. Every punch he had thrown, every maneuver he had planned, had fallen short of its mark. Reacher had slipped past him effortlessly, making Kato look clumsy, almost foolish. And the worst part, the man hadn't said a word, hadn't made a show of his skill. He didn't need to. The silence stretched again. Kato's fists clenched at his sides, the muscle in his jaw tightening. He had been a master for years, an authority in his craft. But standing across from Reacher, all that mastery seemed to evaporate. The calmness in the man's eyes was the real challenge, a challenge that wasn't about power, but about control. Reacher didn't need to dominate the room. He simply controlled himself. And in doing so, he made Kato feel small, like the spectacle Kato had so carefully cultivated meant nothing in the face of true focus. Kato lunged, a quick strike to Reacher's midsection, hoping to catch him off guard. But once again, Reacher was already moving. It wasn't even a dodge. It was just the way he shifted his body, a slight lean to the left that allowed the blow to pass harmlessly. Kato's eyes flashed with fury, and for the first time, doubt crept in. This wasn't a fight he could win through force alone. He wasn't facing a man who relied on technique or tactics. He was facing someone who had mastered stillness, someone who could see through every move before it even happened. And as Kato stood there, breathless, staring into Reacher's unyielding calm, he realized he wasn't in control anymore. Not of the fight, not of the room, not of the dojo. It was slipping away from him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Kato's chest heaved as he circled, trying to regain his bearings. Sweat trickled down his brow, his GI now clinging to his body with a weight of frustration and disbelief. Every move he made, every strike he threw, felt sluggish, calculated, and yet utterly ineffective against the stillness of Reacher. The dojo, once filled with confidence, now felt like an arena of uncertainty. Kato had always prided himself on his ability to control the outcome, to dominate his opponents. But with each passing second, that illusion was slipping away. Reacher didn't rush. He didn't taunt. He simply moved with a precision that seemed effortless, his gaze steady and unwavering. There was no theatrics, no flair, just an impenetrable calm that unnerved Kato more than any punch or kick could. The more Kato pressed, the more the realization set in. He was not going to win this fight. Kato's attack came in a flurry, an attempt to overwhelm, to break the silence and force Reacher into a mistake. His fists flew in a series of punches, jabs, and hooks, each designed to break the man's defense. But with each swing, Reacher slipped past them with ease, his movements fluid and controlled, like water flowing around a stone. It was impossible to predict, impossible to counter. Then, without warning, Reacher stepped in. It was so subtle, so precise, that Kato didn't see it coming until it was too late. In one smooth motion, Reacher sidestepped and extended his arm, using Kato's own momentum to twist his body and throw him to the mat. The dojo fell into complete silence as Kato hit the ground hard, the impact ringing through the room like the final toll of a bell. For a moment, Kato lay there, stunned, his breath shallow and quick. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, a reason for his defeat. But there was none. Reacher hadn't beaten him through power or speed. He had defeated him through presence, through control, through the simple act of not reacting. Kato slowly pushed himself up, eyes locked on Reacher. The fight was over, and for the first time in his life, the master was the one who had been humbled. Kato pushed himself to his feet, his hands trembling slightly as he steadied himself against the mat. The weight of the defeat pressed down on him, heavier than any physical blow. He hadn't just lost a fight. He had lost something far more important. His reputation, his teachings, the very core of what he had built in this dojo, had been called into question. And it was clear now that Reacher wasn't just challenging him as a fighter. He was challenging everything Kato believed about mastery, discipline, and strength. As Kato rose to face him, his chest tightened. His pride, the thing he'd always relied on to carry him through every challenge, was cracking. He had taught his students to fight with everything they had, to fight with pride and intensity, to dominate and be relentless. But Reacher had shown him that there was a different kind of strength, a strength that wasn't about force or domination, but about presence, control, and an unwavering stillness. The dojo's disciples stood at the edges of the room, watching with wide eyes. Their master, their idol, the one who had taught them everything they knew, was being broken down before them, not by fists or kicks, but by the simple act of not reacting. Kato had always preached about the importance of power and aggression, about overwhelming your opponent with force. But here, in front of him, stood a man who had turned that doctrine on its head. How? Kato's voice was rough, the question hanging in the air. How do you do it? Reacher didn't move, didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, his gaze unwavering. It's not about doing anything, he said quietly, his voice carrying through the dojo. It's about not doing. The key to power isn't your fists. It's in knowing when to move and when not to move. Kato's mind raced. The doctrine he had spent a lifetime cultivating was crumbling, and for the first time, he wasn't sure how to fight back. Reacher had broken through more than just his defense. He had shattered the very foundation of Kato's teachings. And now, Kato was forced to confront the truth. His way was not the only way. The room was still, the silence now, an uncomfortable presence that filled every corner. Kato stood, his breath slow and deliberate, eyes never leaving Reacher. His disciples, who had been silent spectators up until now, shuffled awkwardly at the edges of the dojo, unsure whether to leave or stay. The fight was over, but something else lingered in the air, a conversation that had yet to happen. Reacher remained calm, his posture relaxed, his face unreadable. He hadn't said a word since the fight ended, hadn't celebrated his victory, hadn't even acknowledged Kato's failure. His quietness had become a force in itself, a constant reminder of the way he had handled the entire encounter, the way he handled everything. Kato finally broke the silence, his voice a little hoarse, as though the fight had taken more from him than just his pride. "You never said a word during the fight," he began, the question heavy in his voice. "Not once. Not even when you had the chance to gloat, to mock." Reacher's eyes flicked to Kato, his expression as calm as ever. He shook his head slightly, as if the idea of taunting or showing off was foreign to him. "Words don't matter in a fight," he said simply. "It's what you do, not what you say." Kato absorbed the words, his mind racing. The defeat stung, but the quiet clarity in Reacher's response stung more. It wasn't about the fight. It was about everything he had built, the doctrine, the reputation, the idea that strength came from domination. Reacher had just turned that upside down without ever raising his voice. "You've spent your whole life teaching aggression," Reacher continued, his tone soft but unwavering. "But aggression isn't power. Power isn't control. It's in knowing that you don't need to prove anything. Not to anyone." Cato took a deep breath, the weight of the truth settling in. He didn't know what to say. His entire identity, the way he had lived and taught, was built on the idea of being untouchable. But now, in the quiet of the dojo, surrounded by the very students he had once commanded, he was left with nothing but the realization that Reacher was right. Cato stood in the center of the dojo, the weight of Reacher's words settling heavily on him. His mind spun, trying to find a way to assert control again, to take back the ground he had lost. But every time he attempted to organize his thoughts, Reacher's quiet demeanor cut through it all, like a still pond untouched by any disturbance. There was no anger, no arrogance, just the calm, knowing presence of a man who didn't need to say much to have everything in hand. The disciples were scattered around the room, their eyes flicking between their master and the stranger who had just humbled him. Cato could feel their gaze, their expectation, the shift in their loyalty. In that silence, he realized he wasn't the man they had thought he was, not anymore. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of quiet tension, Reacher spoke. His voice was low, unhurried, as if the moment had stretched out just for this one question. "Do you still believe your way is the only way?" The question wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a taunt. It was simple, direct, and carried an honesty that cut straight to the heart of everything Cato had spent years defending. Cato froze, the air in the dojo thickening around him. His initial instinct was to lash out, to deny, to assert that he had always been right, that his way had worked for decades. But something stopped him. The certainty in Reacher's eyes, the quiet way he waited for a response, forced him to confront the truth he had been avoiding. The doctrine Cato had lived by, one of domination, of aggression, of proving superiority, suddenly seemed hollow. Reacher hadn't needed to break him physically. He had broken him with one question, one simple line that made everything Cato had built feel fragile. Cato's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. The room was so quiet now, so heavy with the expectation of an answer, that Cato felt like he was sinking into it, deeper and deeper, until nothing else mattered. It was the first time in years that Cato had truly doubted himself. And for the first time, the answer wasn't clear. The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Cato stood motionless, staring at Reacher, his mind scrambling for a response. The silence stretched between them, pressing in on him from all sides. His thoughts, once sharp and direct, now felt muddled, uncertain. He had spent his entire life believing in the doctrine he had built, the lessons he had passed down to his disciples. But in the face of Reacher's stillness, those beliefs seemed fragile, almost flimsy. For the first time in years, Cato questioned everything. His mastery, his teachings, his belief that strength was rooted in aggression and dominance. The way he had forced his students to fight for every inch, the relentless pursuit of power, the control he held over them. Was it all worth it? Was it the right way? He had always considered himself untouchable, a man who stood above others in his knowledge, his skill, his ability to command respect. But now, standing before Reacher, those years of self-assurance felt like a house built on sand. With every passing second, Reacher's quiet presence eroded the foundation Cato had relied on. Cato's eyes shifted toward his disciples, the ones who had looked up to him, followed him without question. They were still, their gazes darting between their master and the man who had so easily unraveled him. Cato could see the doubt creeping into their eyes as well. They had always believed in him, but now they were witnessing his failure, and the thought of losing their respect, their loyalty, made something inside him twist painfully. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. His throat felt tight, his mind blank. He had always been able to speak with authority, to command a room with his voice and presence, but now he had nothing to say, There was no justification, no defense. Only silence. The silence of a man who had been forced to confront the truth he had long avoided. Kato took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the floor. The weight of his doubt was crushing. In that moment, he realized that the fight he had just lost was more than physical. It was the loss of everything he thought he knew about strength. The weight of silence continued to press down on the dojo. Kato's mind was a storm, swirling with confusion, frustration, and disbelief. He had spent so many years building this place, this reputation, this way of life, that to have it all called into question by one simple exchange was unfathomable. His grip on the dojo's teachings, the doctrine of power, aggression, and dominance, had been his armor. But now, in the face of Reacher's quiet certainty, that armor felt like it was crumbling piece by piece. The disciples stood, motionless, their eyes wide with unease. Kato could feel their gaze, some with concern, others with uncertainty. He had always prided himself on being a rock, unshakable in his beliefs, someone who could inspire unquestioning loyalty. But now he was standing at the edge of a precipice, the ground beneath him slipping away. "Do you want to know what's wrong with your teachings?" Reacher's voice cut through the tension, calm and steady. Kato looked up, his eyes narrowing in irritation, but there was no denying the weight of the question that hung in the air. Reacher didn't move, didn't change his expression. He was the same unyielding presence that had challenged Kato from the beginning. Kato opened his mouth, ready to lash out, but the words died in his throat. Reacher wasn't asking for a fight anymore. He was offering something more dangerous, understanding. "The problem," Reacher continued, "is that you've taught your disciples to fight with the goal of defeating others, instead of learning about themselves. Strength isn't about overpowering someone. It's about knowing when to act, when to be still, when to control not just your opponent, but yourself." Kato swallowed hard, the words ringing in his ears. He had always believed in the idea of fighting for dominance, for respect, for control. But Reacher's words struck at something deeper, something he had never allowed himself to see. The revelation was slow, creeping in, unsettling him in ways that words alone couldn't capture. He had spent his life teaching others to fight, but never teaching them how to stop, how to listen, how to control themselves. And now, faced with the quiet force of Reacher's presence, Kato realized that true mastery wasn't just about defeating others. It was about mastering oneself. Kato's world shifted as Reacher's words settled in. He had always believed that the fight was the end game, the ultimate measure of strength. But as the weight of his own teachings began to falter, he realized something he had never considered. The fight wasn't over when the opponent hit the mat. It was over when the mind could no longer deceive itself into believing it had control. Reacher didn't wait for Kato's response. He simply observed, his stance relaxed but focused, the quiet strength in his posture like a steady pulse in the room. Kato's mind raced, trying to put the pieces together, but nothing seemed to fit anymore. His entire life had been built on a foundation of aggression, of pushing, of making others submit. But now, with each breath, that foundation felt less like a bedrock and more like shifting sand beneath his feet. Kato took a slow, deliberate step forward, unwilling to admit just how deeply Reacher's calmness had rattled him. He had always expected his authority to be unquestionable, his skill unmatched. But in the quiet of the dojo, with his disciples watching, Kato realized he wasn't the untouchable master he had always believed himself to be. He launched himself at Reacher again, his body moving with speed and aggression, a blur of muscle and rage. This time, however, he wasn't thinking about the fight. He was thinking about saving face, about regaining the control he had lost. The punch came fast, aimed for Reacher's jaw, a strike that could have ended the fight in an instant. But Reacher saw it coming. With a small, deliberate shift, he moved to the side, not reacting with force, but with precision. Kato's punch passed harmlessly through the air. He felt a jolt of panic. Before he could reset, Reacher's hand shot out, grabbing his arm with a fluid, almost effortless motion. It was like being caught in the tide, unable to stop the pull. In that instant, Kato realized something that had eluded him for so long. The fight wasn't about his speed, his strength, or his mastery. It was about his ability to adapt. And for the first time, Reacher had shown him what true mastery looked like, not in the fight, but in the stillness before it. Kato's body burned with exhaustion, his muscles stiff and sore from the relentless barrage of frustration that had filled the past minutes. The dojo, once a place of controlled chaos, now felt like a cage closing in around him. His thoughts were a jumbled mess: rage, disbelief, desperation. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of every fight. But now, facing Reacher, he was more aware of his limitations than ever. His disciples, who had once hung on every word he said, now looked at him with uncertain eyes.